You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 201. You're listening to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sarah Thomas, providing you with resources to navigate the challenges and opportunities of courageous, Christ-centered leaders. Today we're having a conversation with Scott Hicks. Scott is a part-time local pastor, he is an immigration attorney, and he is a wealth of information and wisdom on this podcast. We cover a ton of ground. He talks about immigration and what we tend to get wrong and what he wants us to know about the system that we are currently living in. We talk about how racism has pervaded the immigration system and how being followers of Jesus should be guiding our actions and where that's happening and where it's not happening. And he invites us to refocus and to remember what Jesus talks about caring for the widow and the orphan and the person who is oppressed and the foreigner. And we also talk about the changing nature of the church and how Scott is currently leading his congregation. I'm not going to recap the entire episode for you because I want you to listen to Scott's words and what he has to share. Just know that this whole episode is filled with wisdom upon wisdom. So without any further wait, here is our conversation with Scott Hicks.
Well, welcome, Scott, to LeaderCast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
To help our listeners know who you are, let me just ask you, who are you and what do you get paid to do?
Well, I wish that was a simple answer, but I guess the basic answer is I have multiple roles. I am a part-time local pastor in the UMC, and I serve a very small church near where I live here in Ohio. And then the other part of my role is I actually have multiple parts of being an attorney. The primary focus of my practice is immigration cases, specifically trying to get families united to stay here, people who are seeking protection in one way or another from having to go back to their original country. And I do other kinds of law, but that's the primary focus.
What we talk about most on this podcast is courageous leadership, being a courageous leader. So what does being a courageous leader mean to you?
Well, I guess first and foremost, it requires authenticity and truth. I sometimes have to tell people what they don't want to hear, but I feel like that's loving them. And so along with that authenticity, along with that truthfulness, is really, for me, courageous leader is somebody who's willing to act in the best interests of the person you're trying to serve. And sometimes that requires telling them things they don't want to hear. Sometimes it requires taking steps or actions that are unpopular, that are unpopular, and yet you still do them, not because you are concerned about what may happen, but just because you know that that's really what needs to be done. And I think that I've had to learn as well that a courageous leader can't do it without genuinely caring about the people you're trying to serve and trying to stand for truth and also stand up for justice. And so those are, I guess, my basic thoughts about being courageous in leadership.
Being a pastor and being an immigration attorney, I'm sure that courageous leadership intersects at those places. Part of what we're talking about for the month of October is understanding history and context and leadership. And I know that may not show up immediately in talking about being a pastor and immigration law, but I am interested in how those two roles intersect for you. How does that actually play out? I mean, I'm guessing, Scott, you can count on one hand the number of pastors and immigration lawyers you know. So how does that intersect for you?
Yeah, it's a very unusual combination. I've been practicing as a lawyer since 1995, and I started with an appointment as a local pastor. I think it was 2007. I served 7 years at one parish, and then I'm in my 7th year at this particular location. And for years, it didn't seem like the two crossed. I mean, people knew I was an immigration attorney. They knew I was a pastor, but the roles were really somewhat distinct. But a few years ago, there was a group of pastors that were putting together a legislation at the annual conference, encouraging and reminding the conference that we have responsibilities as people of faith to protect the foreigner. And eventually they got referred to me just to kind of look over what that legislation said and were they really understanding some of the issues. And from that, I went from an advisory role to I became the lead voice at the conference. And, and it from there, it expanded because as part of what we were saying is we needed to not just have words, we needed to have deeds carrying out our faith. And so I really just started emailing people and calling people and saying, hey, I'd like to put some legs to this legislation. Would you be interested in walking that journey with me as well? And so we put together a team here, primarily in the ORV district, but really it involved people all over the conference. How do we help in this context, in this field? And from there, it just seems to have grown. A few years ago, I ventured into Facebook, and I really, I just looked at it as kind of, is this really something I want to do? But, it helped me connect with people. And it was in November, a few years ago, I wrote this long, boring post about what's the actual process of vetting a refugee. And I put it up there mainly just as a voice of this is what really happens. And the thing went viral. And I was, several 100,000 shares later, I'm like, oh my gosh, my phone was blowing up over Thanksgiving, because we'd gone to see my wife's folks. And that resulted in a platform that I would have never anticipated. I'm closing in on 12,000 followers. And, I joke with my college buddies that if you had picked any one of us, that this is the person with, a following on Facebook, it would never. And so it's kind of been the fascinating part is I look at it as God continues to open doors that I didn't even know existed. And so you just try to be faithful and try to stay with what's the truth and how do we help people in this area.
Yeah, as we were preparing for this, I wrote on the note to you, Scott, you unknowingly compete on Facebook with an epidemiologist that I have followed since the pandemic began for writing thoughtful, timely posts to share information when things are happening in the world. So thank you for that role. You never think of social media being a ministry of presence, but you facilitate that. And I'm calling it a ministry because I see your faith shining through when you are responding to some of the folks that are not always kind on Facebook. We have all seen things like that. So I'm wondering, in the context of, as we're thinking about this big idea of history and context and leadership, and when it comes to immigration, there's a long history of misunderstanding, a long history of complexity. And I'm wondering if there are two or three, and I might be asking for a miracle here, two or three things that you wish that most U.S. citizens knew and understood about immigration.
Yeah, the list is almost endless, it seems. I always find it humorous on Facebook when, I post something or explain something. I've been doing this for over 2 decades, and it's my livelihood. And somebody will come on and basically start talking about, what they think in their opinion, but they'll assert that this is what the law is, or this is what, and I'm like, well, that's actually not the case. And people, we've entered into a society that we don't value experts. And so it's always interesting to me when somebody tells me that who's never practiced law, who doesn't know anything other than what they've read on Facebook. They know the immigration law, me. But,
Yep.
I think how I explain it is Americans have this mythology, and the mythology is five and an American tale. You get on a boat, you show up, the streets are made of cheese and there are no cats, and that people really think that's how it is. I mean, I've talked to, like a magistrate I know a few years ago, and I was telling her about the complexity of coming here. She's like, wait a minute, you're telling me that, like, if you're an architect or an engineer or a doctor in Sweden, you can't just get on a plane and come here? Like, are you kidding? No, it doesn't work that way. And I think that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions that people have is and I hear this all the time. Why don't they just follow rules? And it's like, because there are no rules to follow. For most people, there is never, ever a path to get here. And we could change that. We could make our laws so that people could, in fact, come in and, follow a system and do all the things that people say they want. But the reality is there's no path. There is no system to follow for so many. And even those that do want to follow the path, who have the opportunity, the wait lists are incredibly long. I talk to people regularly and they say, well, I'm a U.S. citizen. I'd like to bring my brother or my sister. I'm like, well, we can do that. It'll take a minimum of 10 to 12 years, probably longer. Or they'll say, well, I became a citizen. I've got adult children. We'd like to be together as a family. What can I do? I'm like, well, we can start that paperwork, but it's going to take anywhere from 7 to 15 years to get them here. And that's if you're not Mexican. If you're Mexican, the wait list can be 30, 40, 50 years. And people just don't understand that. They don't understand how difficult it actually is to come. And so that's one thing I would say. And just an illustration, I had a conversation earlier today, and it was one of the good conversations. You actually get to call the client and say, congratulations, you are now a permanent resident. You've got a green card. But her situation was that she was here legally and she wanted to stay and visit. And so she applied to get that extension. And under the rules that we have, you have to stay in the United States while that's being processed by immigration. Well, they take sometimes so long that you're only supposed to be able to be able to ask for a certain period of time. And if immigration doesn't make the decision, you have to actually send in another application asking for another extension while you're still waiting on the first extension. And in the meantime, she realized that she could have had an opportunity to go to school, and that requires yet another application. Well, what happened was that she got to this, a year and a half later, and immigration approved the first extension. And they sent the notice in June, but they only approved her to March. So she's already 3 months out of status. And meanwhile, she has these other applications out there. So a few weeks later, she gets the application for the second extension. It says, yes, you're good. We extend you till September. Okay, everything's good now, right? Okay, well, like literally a week later, she gets the decision on the application to become a student. And they say, well, your status expired in March and you aren't going to be a student till September. So we deny you. And you're shaking your head. You're like, she's done everything she's supposed to do. She's done it when she's supposed to do it. And here she is now being told, no, sorry. But it gets worse because in the meantime, she'd actually met and married a U.S. citizen. And they had filed the paperwork in October asking for her to become a permanent resident. Well, they went to the interview, and in the meantime, the service center that denied the student application put her in deportation. And so they got to the interview here in Cincinnati, and the officer was like, I don't have any problems with your marriage. That's not a problem. I approve that, but I'm not allowed to approve your green card because you're in front of the judge, and you're going to have to wait for the judge to make a decision unless he closes the case and sends it back to us. Well, so it takes months and months and months to get to a judge. And by the time they were supposed to go, we were in full pandemic shutdown. And so, we ended up going over a year with no court hearings, no ability to do anything. And the government attorneys wouldn't respond to any, let's shut this down until the new administration finally said it was okay for them to do that. And so last month, we finally got the case shut down. And today we finally got word that immigration had said, yes, we approve your case. But they were following the rules. And it still was, she has, when I talked to her today, she was like, does this mean I'm going to be able to finally go see my family for the first time in years? I'm like, yes, as soon as you get that green card, you can travel. And she's nearly weeping with joy that finally her case is approved. But it never should have been that complicated, is what you say. But that's exactly how immigration is, all the time. That's a couple of the things that I would say people don't understand. And there's one other thing that I think people really don't understand about immigration, and it relates to our history. What people don't understand is, because again, they have this mythology that, you can get on a boat, land at Ellis Island, be checked in, and, you're in America. The reality is that starting in the 19-teens and culminating in the 1920s, we said, we don't want certain people here. And so we rewrote the law under the Quota Act and said, only people can come who, based on the 1880 census. Well, guess who that excluded? It excluded Asians. They were explicitly forbidden from coming. It essentially excluded Africans. It excluded Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans. Essentially, the only people that we allowed into the United States from early 1920s all the way up to in the mid 60s were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And it was an explicitly racist law. I mean, if you go back and you read the arguments in Congress of the sponsors of why they said this was so important, they made no bones about it. They were like, we want only these kind of people to come. And in the 60s, the civil rights movement's going on. People are starting to go, wait a minute, we really shouldn't be like this. And so they changed the law and they made it facially neutral. In other words, you can look at the immigration laws now and there's no race, criteria or anything like that. But here's the thing. What we did is we kept quotas, we called preferences. And so what we said was, if you're going to come as a family member, you can only come if you already have somebody in the United States to sponsor you. who's already in a U.S. citizen or a green card holder. Well, okay, if prior to 1965, the only people in the United States and who come are white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, guess who's already here to serve as your sponsor for the next level of immigration? And so even though we made the law racially neutral, we still have that impact flowing in our immigration system. And so, it's one of those things that a lot of people don't like to acknowledge. They don't like to acknowledge certain parts of history. They don't like to acknowledge the ugly side of how we systematically put into our power structures and into our laws this idea. And I think that most Americans have no idea that is our history and that it continues to ripple through even into today.
So, Scott, regarding what you've just said, when we hear people talk about, or the media talk about, or our politicians talk about changing immigration law, it's not that law they're talking about, though, is it? When they talk about changing immigration law, all the things that you've just said, you've had somebody who followed the rules, did everything. That's not what we're talking about changing, though, is it?
No. Immigration is inherently, it's inherently political, in Congress. I mean, because the president and the executive branch has enormous amounts of power. We've seen that with each president over the last couple of decades. But the reality is the executive can only act within what Congress has legislated. Now, you may be able to push the envelope or develop new interpretations of what the power actually is. But at the end of the day, you have to ground it in some act of Congress. And Congress has essentially been deadlocked for the last 20 plus years. And so what you end up with, and this is what drives me crazy about both Republicans and Democrats. I don't like either one of them, frankly. But what we have bought into is this culture of fear that we do not operate, in terms of looking at people as positive things. Instead, we look at immigrants as threats. We look at them as, how are they going to destroy my community? We look at them as stealing jobs. And it runs completely contrary to our actual history of when we had large amounts of immigration. But what we end up with is and we saw it just recently on the border. We saw the images of the Border Patrol on horseback, using their reins to whip back corral the Haitians trying to come in. That's nothing new. In terms of that attitude, we have long had this arm the border, treat the border as a war zone. And we look the whole national security, deport them as fast as you can, truncate the rights. That has been going on for as long as I've been practicing, but it keeps getting worse. And it doesn't matter whether it's Democrat or Republican as president. It doesn't matter whether Republicans have the House or the Democrats have the House. It just, that mentality and that has just really informed the debate. And so simple things can't even get done because you oftentimes have at least one part or significant enough of one party saying, we're not going to do anything about immigration unless you make it harsh, unless you make it harder, unless we can enforce more. And it's always an enforcement based approach. And, I think that that's poor policy, but, we can have that debate. But as a person of faith, I don't understand that approach at all, because that is not how God treats us. And that's not how we approach God. And so, as a person of faith, I think it's important that we bring that to bear and ask ourselves, what are we really exhibiting? What are we really living out here in our words and what we're saying should happen?
So how are you helping the church be immigration advocates?
Well, I spend a fair amount of time trying to educate, to answer questions and to say, no, that's not really how it is. And, and I think part of what gets lost, it seems more so now, and maybe I just wasn't clued in earlier in my life, but I see more and more people of faith who are not operating from a perspective of faith, but they're operating from their politics or their ideology. And there's a place for that. I mean, we can all have disagreements or agreements about what we think is a good policy or not on taxes or name your issue. But I think what we oftentimes miss is the heart of God. And, I once sat down and read through, what did God have to say about immigrants? And I was shocked because, the number one commandment that God gives his people is love me. That love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, body, soul. That commandment, everybody knows that. But most people don't realize that the second most repeated command is do not oppress the foreigner and protect the widow, protect the orphan. Those three are always linked together because they were vulnerable populations. And then I started to look and started to read a bit more and realized that, Jesus showed up in his opening sermon, which didn't go real well. Was I came here to set the captive free, to give sight to the blind, to help the lame walk, but then he says, and to set the oppressed free. And so Jesus has this heart for those on the margins, the most vulnerable, the weak, poor, the oppressed. And when I started thinking and reflecting on that, and then I looked at what I'm hearing so many of my fellow Christians emphasize and talk about, there was a real disconnect. And I was really puzzled. Well, wait a minute, why are we talking about immigrants in this way when God clearly is talking about them in a different way? And I saw that, Jesus, his last sermon, if you will, which we put in Matthew 25, he's talking about, are you taking care of the least of these? And he talks about, did you feed me? Did you give me water? Did you clothe? But he also says, did you welcome the stranger? And I think that gets lost in American culture in the English translation, because if you really look at the culture, if you look at the lineage of what Jesus was talking about, it's almost impossible to come to the conclusion that Jesus wasn't talking about foreigners. And so here we have Jesus himself saying, did you welcome the foreigner? And when you start to think of that, and then you start comparing what our policies are, and worse, what the church people might be advocating for policies, I see so much a disconnect between what Jesus was saying and what I'm hearing. And so part of what I want people to understand is, I want you to think about this not in terms of Republican or Democrat, not in terms of liberal or conservative. I want you to think about this in terms of Jesus. How did Jesus talk about this? How did Jesus treat people? And how do we model and follow that example? How do we live that out and be consistent? And I tell people all the time, Jesus would not make the Republicans happy. Jesus would not make the Democrats happy. He's going to infuriate both of them. Now maybe on some things, one party likes him better than the other and vice versa. But the reality is, to be a person of faith is a different it's a different calling, and it's a different criteria. And so, are we Americans and are we Republicans or are we Democrats first, or are we followers of Jesus? And so that's part of what I try to, when I have conversations with church people, that's kind of where I try to land. I try to land less on the merits of the arguments and more on how does your faith inform your thinking on this?
I'll just say thank you for the work that you're doing and the conversations that you're having, because we need to have more of them. And I've heard Tim say many, many times that it matters where you start. And so if you're starting with Jesus, you end up in a very different place than if you start with an argument or start with your politics or start with your party. And I would say we probably could have much more constructive conversations and learn more about one another and the challenges that we're facing if we started with Jesus than if we started with the political aspects of it. So thank you for leading folks in that direction and helping them to have what I would call are courageous conversations.
Well, and if I can add something, I have a lot of conversations outside of the church with people, and I have, like I said, I've got a lot of followers on Facebook, and I talk about immigration all the time, and we rarely have problem people coming on and just, getting out of control. I say that, Law Dog gets to enforce the rules on that. And he's a very kind and compassionate animal. But, what I have discovered is that for the most part, you can have difficult conversations if people think that you are being truthful and if they think you're being fair. And so, I can say things and discuss things that even if the person doesn't agree with me, they can listen and respect what I'm saying. And I've been surprised over the years how people will send me private messages saying, when I first started following you, I didn't know what to think, or I didn't agree with you, but you've changed my mind. And I think that, I can't argue you into changing what you believe. I just don't believe that. As a lawyer, that pains me to say. but as as a person who's had enough experience with humanity, all it can really do is offer you things to think about and to try to be a person of integrity, so that when I do tell you, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to mislead you. I'm giving you real information, and what you do with it is up to you. And so I think there used possibly, maybe I'm not old enough to know, but my impression is that used to happen more. And in our current culture, it doesn't happen enough, but it does sometimes happen. And so that's partly why I persist in taking the positions I do and letting, almost all my posts on Facebook are public. And people will say, can I share this? I'm like, well, yeah. I assume if I put it on Facebook, it can be shared. But I do that in the hopes oftentimes that people will share, because I feel like if people are willing to listen and willing to think, that's progress. And at least we can have a more productive conversation.
That's good. So, Scott, I understand that you have also been leading a church through reimagining their future. And I'm wondering if you might share with us a little bit of what role history and context have played in your leadership of leading people through reimagining that future of the church.
That's a difficult question for me, maybe to wrap my answer around directly, but maybe what I can do is tell you what's happening, and we might be able to figure out together, how that answers the question. I'm here at a small country church. It's in Oregonia, Ohio, which is literally a one block speck on the map. And we were always a small church. I mean, pre-pandemic, if we had 20 people in the building on a Sunday, that was a lot. And then the pandemic hit and we went all online, which I had never done in my life. And so I'm learning on the fly how to do this along with so many other pastors and congregations. And to be honest, we had some real conflict. I had a significant contingent of my body that did not want to be online, and they wanted to be in the building right now. And ironically, we were actually one of the first churches to let people back in, but we did so, with some safety precautions. And when you're such a small number, it's easier to carry, social distancing and other safety techniques off. But, the pandemic just, it messed with people so much, and it stirred up some things that we were having a difficult time getting through, to the point where, frankly, by this time last year, my pastor parish committee met and came back to me and said, well, the question is no longer whether we want to get rid of you. The question is, are we going to keep the doors open? I'm like, oh, good. That's not a better conversation, And so we started having this conversation of, okay, well, so what are we going to do? Are we going to shut the doors? And my assistant DS had a conversation with me as we're going through this conflict, and she had pitched this. What would you think about starting an online church? And I'm like, sure, but what does that mean? What does that mean? I had no idea what that meant or how to do. My dad was a pastor. I grew up in the church. I was in the church every single time the door opened, just about, so I have a lifetime of experience in church. And yet I still had no idea what she was talking about or what that might look like or how to do it. And so, I just kind of like, okay, I guess I'll think about it, maybe try to research it and try to figure out, what that might mean. And meanwhile, my church is imploding. I've got a significant wing that says, please don't let the door hit you on the way out. And I've got a significant wing that's saying, we don't want you to leave. And, and I've got a significant wing that's like, can we just all stop fighting? And yet, Suzanne told me something significant. And she said, you can't have a resurrection unless there's a death. And so I realized it's okay to go through this season to figure out, maybe we don't survive this, but maybe this is laying the groundwork for something different, something new. And eventually we did transition. We basically said, we're not going to be the normal church. And we thought, well, we'll just be like a missional station, which kind of left me in an awkward place. And it's like, you don't need a pastor to do that, and Suzanne is basically telling me, look, you got to guide him through this transition, and we can talk about your future later. If you can get him to survive, we can talk about your future at that point, but you're it. They're either going to live with you or they're going to die with you, but this is your job. This is your role. And I'm like, thanks. And so we had a lot of conversations, and we had a lot of really important discussions about what is God asking us to do, and how do we do that? How do we reach out to our community? And in the meantime, we had basically said, we're just going to shut Sunday mornings down. We're not going to worry about a worship service. We're going to work on other things in sharing the good news. And eventually they kind of came back and said, well, we know you've been doing this online, the services anyway. Do you think you could continue that? And, we can, we'll, those of us that want to attend, we can, and those of us that don't, no problem. And I'm like, okay. And I kind of looked at that as, okay, well, let's experiment. Let's see what works. Let's see what doesn't. And from that has developed some things that I never could have predicted. We now have really, we have very few people in the, we get maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 people in the building on a Sunday morning, but we're live streaming the service, and we have people from all over the country who are joining us. And we said, we want a way to connect. And so we do part of our service on Facebook. We do part of our service on Zoom. And so we have people from all over the country who are connecting in by Zoom, and we're sharing, this is what God's doing. This is what I need prayer for. This is what I always give people an opportunity to share how did God speak to them during the service and during the message. And we do a small group, and our small group used to be 10 people from the church local. Now I have more people coming on Zoom on Wednesday nights, participating in a small group discipleship from all over the country than I do who are local. And we're having these conversations about, okay, how do we think about ourselves? Because we're no longer Oregonia UMC in Oregonia, Ohio. We now have a satellite campus in Buffalo. We've got a satellite campus in Kansas City. We've got a satellite campus somewhere in the middle of nowhere in Texas. We've got a satellite campus in, California or Washington or Indiana. And so it's presenting completely new challenges and completely new opportunities. But what's exciting is to see, I'm seeing people make comments on Facebook. For example, I saw one of my people who's in Indiana, and she shared a post I made about what does it mean to be a Christian in terms of our witness. And she shared that, and somebody asked her a question, and her response was, "This is my pastor in my church." And I'm like, how does that happen? How do you have a church that's not even physically gathered, and yet we're connected? And I know a lot of people are, I read the stuff that says, if it's not in person, it's not real. It has to be in person. You're missing something. And I'm like, okay, I get that, but you don't get it. This is real. This is connect. And this is the body of Christ universal. Our theology says, and we're coming up on it in about a month. Our theology says that the body of Christ is all the saints who came before, all the saints who are, and all the saints who are to come. And we all gather together. I don't understand that. It's metaphysical, but it's real. And so in a sense, we've tapped a new reality of we are connected in faith and working to share the good news of Jesus Christ in new ways. And that's church. And so we are building, if you will, a new context. We're building a new history, but it comes from a place of authenticity. It comes from a place of truth. It comes from a place of, I care more about you than I do about anything else. And so, I have in our small group, I have an atheist. I could have never, ever reached an atheist in the normal way we did church before. And that person comes in and they ask questions, and really good questions. And we have good conversations. And my people, they figured out what she thinks or doesn't think and believes and doesn't believe. And yet, you know what? They still love her. And, she'll say things like, I feel kind of hypocritical, but I'm not sure I can ask for prayer about this. And I'm like, cause she's like, I don't really believe. I'm like, that's okay. We do, and those are the kinds of conversations that the church needs to have. And I feel strongly that God has opened up doors that weren't open before. And part of my task is simply to not be afraid to figure it out. Because I talked with Suzanne at one point, and I said, here's my question. And she was like, yeah, we're kind of at the cutting edge and we don't have the answer to that. You're going to have to figure that out. And, that's okay. We don't have all the answers. What we have is Jesus. And that's enough. That's enough to love each other, and we'll figure out everything else as we go.
Oh, Scott, if more people could hear that, and then seek to just live that out, we make it so much harder than it really needs to be so often. Is there anything else that you want to share about the big idea that we've been talking about, and probably more particularly anything that Law Dog would like to add to the conversation?
Law Dog and I are in complete agreement. At the end of the day, it's people that matter. Oranges and popcorn are nice. But, really, the longer I've gone about this in my faith journey, and particularly as a leader of faith, I am just more and more convinced that our faith comes down to relationships. It comes down to loving God, but the way we love God is we love each other. And so if we can just get that, we've got our faith, and so, yes, doctrine's important. Yes, I think, correct theology is an important thing. But at the end of the day, do you love one another? And do you live that out consistently? And do you seek to love God and love one, and do you seek to love yourself? I mean, there's so many people that don't love themselves. And so I think that more than anything is more and more what drives me in leading and in following Christ.
That is a good word. Are you ready for the rapid fire questions? The rapid fire questions are quick, fun questions that are simply designed for folks to get to know you as a person a little bit more. First question is, what food is always in your refrigerator?
What food is let's see, breakfast is yogurt and some kind of chicken, and let's see, deli meat for my wife, and, fruit.
You got some balanced food groups there.
Scott, who's one person you'd want to be with you on a deserted island?
Besides my wife?
Maybe she's the one.
She is the one.
What is the last thing that you said to a loved one?
On the phone, it was probably love you, bye. And in person, it was probably I'll see you later.
What's one habit you've picked up during the pandemic?
I actually started running. We were planning a family vacation out west, and it was going to be hiking in like 10,000 feet elevation. And my oldest son called me and said, "Dad, this is not like hiking in Red River Gorge. You need to get to shape." And so I started running, and now I run about 3 times a week, and varies, 5, 6 miles. And that's something I would have never, ever said I would do. And after we took the vacation, I'm like, well, this is really helping me in getting shape. And I it's not something I like in the sense of I look forward to, oh, this is fun, as much as just it's, okay, I can do this. And it has good things that I can see in my health and in my life.
So this is a 2-parter. You choose which question you want to answer. What is your favorite all-time book? Or if that question's too big, what book are you reading right now?
Oh, man. I have so many, but maybe I'll answer it this way. The book that I keep rereading is Tolkien's The Hobbit and the Lord of the Fellowship of the Ring series. I probably read that over every year or every year.
So what's one of your hobbies or a little known skill that you have?
I think people are surprised that I'm actually a pretty good baker. I make pies, and I don't use commercial pie crust. I make my pie crust myself. And so when we get birthdays and holiday gatherings, I'm always the one that does the desserts.
I can't thank you enough for sharing your heart, sharing your wisdom, sharing your faith with us, and also helping us to learn more about this huge topic of immigration and how we can be a part of helping folks to learn more and understand more. I appreciate you and give God thanks for you and the ways that you serve God, both in and through the church, in and through technology, and in and through your practice of law. So thank you for being with us today. Tim, any last words from you?
Scott, you're beating my drum, and that is it boils down to relationships. That people are important and relationships, and it's so important to me that I look at each person that I have contact with is really a way God helps me become more who I'm supposed to be. And so just our time together today, the conversation, I'm a better person. I'm grateful for the conversation, and just to echo what Sarah was saying, all the things that you're doing to help, not only to help people who are in the midst of immigration, but helping those of us who do not understand immigration to have a greater understanding, appreciation, and really a care for people more than a process. We didn't talk about the legal clinic, so when we invite you back for the second time, we'll talk about the legal clinic and how the church and people around might become more involved with that. So thank you.
Hopefully that will be something. We had to basically shut that down due to pandemic safety concerns, and we're looking forward to having a life that doesn't have those problems. And I'm interested in who ends up in our church, and I've told my leadership team that the people we're attracting are the people who've been most hurt by the church, who have given up on church, who don't see themselves ever walking into a building, but who still have a hunger and are still looking for something. And so, I know people question, well, when the pandemic finally goes away, does your church, do the people who've been coming go away? Some of them might, but the truth is the people we've been attracting, they're not interested in going back to the old way. And there's so many people like that they've had a horrible experience with Christians, with Christianity, with the church, but there's still that God-sized hole in them that they're looking for.
Yeah, you're leading someplace that, well, Tim and I have had this conversation of, I have said to many folks, when I talk with pastors and they get frustrated about who is not sitting in their pews right now, I'm like, I don't want to disappoint you, but some of those folks have made a decision and they're not going to come back. So the question becomes the very question that you're asking. How can you be in relationship with them? And what does that look like? And it's not going to look like them coming to you. It's going to look like us going to them. And sometimes the only way that we can do that is via technology. And so if we have it, use it. I look forward to hearing how your journey continues. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Scott, thank you.
Well, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
There are so many nuggets of gold in this conversation with Scott Hicks. I hope that you will listen to it and then listen to it again. Let me remind you of the write it down, talk it out questions for this week and from this conversation with Scott. Simply ask yourself, where are you starting in your understanding of immigration? And maybe think about what Scott shared with us and what you knew and what you didn't know. Second question, how does loving God and loving others guide your actions or inactions as a leader? Someone reminded Scott that you can't have a resurrection without death. So here's the question for you. What is dying in your leadership so that new life can emerge? Next question. Are you starting with Jesus? Or maybe the better question is, what's the difference between starting with Jesus and starting from a political, whether it be liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican point of view? And where do you need to refocus in that? And last but not least, what new challenges and opportunities are emerging in this time of leadership for you? As a reminder, you can find the show notes for this episode, along with these questions and references to things that Scott has brought up in our conversation on the show notes page at transformingmission.org/podcast. And you are looking for episode 201. To go directly to the episode, simply type in transformingmission.org/201. And remember, who you are is how you lead. Bye for now.